The Matthew 5 sermon series was called Check Your Heart. And Check Your Heart was about, anybody? Checking your heart. He wasn't even here. Matthew 5 was about check your heart. And it was about check your heart because there are a series of things that Jesus says in Matthew 5. There's basically a heart check. He's coming at our hearts and he's making us understand that it's not the things that our hearts naturally crave that we should be wanting, but it's the things of the Lord that we should be going after. And the reason why we're naming this one religious is because in Matthew 6, he's on that same, kind of on that same track, but there's a theme in the first 18 verses that kind of stick out. And they stuck out to me because Jesus is kind of condemning a certain type of person, while at the same time not condemning another type of person, which I think is the basis for our this whole sermon series. And I've had a series of conversations. I think I shared this with you a couple of weeks ago. I've had a series of conversations with people who are not Christian and people who express that they are spiritual but not religious. And it's this weird conversation of you like trying to pull out, what do you mean by like you're spiritual but not religious? And it all usually comes down to, oh, well, I pray sometimes. I believe that there's a God somewhere, but I don't ascribe to organized religion. And I'm like, man, that's crazy because like all religion is organized. So you're either like completely not religious or, you know, you're far, far from everything. And then when you do a little bit more digging, most people aren't even spiritual. Like they would say that they're spiritual, but they really aren't. Their behaviors, their habits, the devotion that they have does not show that they're spiritual. So that was another thing that kind of spurred us into this sermon series. So I'm going to quit blabbering and I'm going to go to the text. We're only coming from one verse today, though, which is kind of interesting. And I'm going to try to break down that verse as much as possible. But honestly, Matthew 6:1 is just going to be a thesis statement for the rest of the chapter. Matthew 6:1 is a thesis statement for the rest of the chapter. And Matthew 6:1 reads like this. And I'm reading from the CSB, but it reads like this: be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward with your Father in heaven. In Matthew 6, Jesus uses a couple of words a lot. He uses the word Father a lot. Matter of fact, in the entire Sermon on the Mount, the word Father is mentioned a lot. And we'll go through and look at all of that in the future. Another thing that he uses in this verse and throughout the entire chapter is the word reward. And some would say like, okay, our faith is not about a reward, but there's something there that Jesus is trying to point us to, that, hey, there is an earthly reward that some people go after, and then there's also a heavenly reward that's actually for us. And then another thing that shows up a lot, it's not in this first verse, but it's hinted at. It's the word hypocrite. So for the next 3 months, we'll hear that word over and over and over. Jesus calling people hypocrites for specific reasons. And all of this points to religion and religious people. But we'll see in this that Jesus isn't necessarily calling us to not be religious. He's pointing us to something deeper. And we shouldn't be people who are afraid to be religious, because unlike other systems of belief, the Christian religion is actually just a response to the grace that God has given us. Like we don't have to work to earn anything, to excel, or to establish our own kingdom here on earth. No, Christian religion is really just a response that pulls us away from all of those things that we most naturally would go after. So if we are in faith, we should respond in faithfulness. If we believe in Jesus Christ, our response should be a response of faithfulness. And our confidence shouldn't be wrapped around our ability to accomplish things, because we really can't accomplish anything. But our confidence should be wrapped around the fact that Jesus has already accomplished everything for us. It's a difference in doing religion so that you can get something from God, and actually being active in religion, being faithful in religion because you know God. Those are two different things. And I could go on and on about other world religions, but I don't think that this is what this sermon series should be centered around. I think it actually should be centered around the thought of faithful devotion. And there's a reason why people go to extremes when they talk about religion and not wanting to embrace religion at all, though. And some of you may know that. And that reason is because some people do get hurt deeply by religion. Some of us are hurt deeply by religion. And I think that's the reason why Jesus starts this chapter the way he does. He starts it with a warning. The first verse is Jesus says, be careful not to practice your righteousness. And that's really just the first point right there, that we should be cautious in practicing our religion. Why? For our own benefit. We should be cautious from practicing our own religion for our own benefit. That's what Jesus expresses in the first verse of Matthew 6. Matthew 6:1 is a clear warning, right? There's no getting around that warning. And the warning about religiosity or religion or the ways of religion is a strict one. It's a hard one. Jesus, in this warning, is giving us a framework as well, though. I say that Matthew 6:1 is a thesis statement. And before we get too deep into like the chapter and all of that, let me just explain what I mean when I say religion. Now, there are a lot of definitions for religion out there. If you Google it, like you'll get lost because there's a lot. When we say religion, people mean different things. Matter of fact, if you say religion in the church, it means probably a different thing that if I walked out on the street and I asked somebody if they ascribe to a religion. But religion always focuses around a few things: belief, spiritual practice, an object of worship, a guide, a tradition, and a view of eternity. I'm going to repeat that. It always involves belief. It always involves some level of faith. You believe something. I mean, even atheists believe something, right? I mean, there are all types of people out there and all types of religion. And all religion involves belief. You have to have some level of faith. There's always some level of spiritual practice. Some religions go hard and there's 1,000,001 things you have to do. And some religions are a little bit more slack and there are not a lot of things that you have to do. But there's always some level of spiritual practice, prayer and time with God and all of those things. There's always spiritual practice there. Then there's always an object of worship. There's a deity. There's God. There's someone that we spend our time worshiping. There's a guide as well, whether that be a pastor or some level of guru or somebody who's coaching you through this religious experience. Then there's also tradition. And I think this is the funny one because I think this is what people refer to a lot when they say that they don't want to deal with religion. It's tradition. But my wheels turn on that because it's like, how can you establish any level of validity without a track record of you doing something regularly over time? That's all tradition is. All tradition is a track record of people doing something over and over for a certain amount of time. And then there's always a view of eternity. No religion is absent of a view of eternity. Either you keep going through this life over and over until you get it right, or there's paradise waiting for you with all the things that you've ever dreamed of. There's some level of high heaven that's up there that you can look to go to. And for us as Christians, the thing that we can celebrate is not just heaven, but heaven on earth. Religion involves all of those things. But for our time in the next few months, I would give us a definition from Matthew 6 like this: that religion is simply the regular displaying of devotion through belief, practice, and worship. Religion is simply the regular displaying of devotion through belief, practice, and worship. Again, I'm not ignorant to the fact that when people hear the word religion, it may make them cringe because of things that they've gone through in the past. And again, that's why I say Jesus warns people. The biggest thing we can get from Matthew 6 is Jesus' warning. Be careful. Religion can be dangerous. Be careful. That there are actually hypocritical people involved with religion. Jesus doesn't stray away from that. Actually, he calls them out. He talks about the hypocritical nature of some religious people. And as we go through Matthew 6, we'll see that Jesus doesn't hold back in saying that these people are judgmental, that they want something that's all about them, that they don't care deeply about Jesus, but they care deeply about themselves. It's true that you can do a lot of religious acts and still not know God. You can do a lot of religious acts and still not know God. And this is the soft place that Jesus is pressing on, Matthew 6. And I would say that's because religion is just a system. Religion is just a system, and systems are almost always abused. Religion is simply a system. It's simply a collection of tools that can be used to help us. It can be used to benefit us for the good. But tools can be used the wrong way as well. If I had a hammer right now and there was something loose on this table and I wanted to gently tap it so that I can make sure that the table is intact, then that would be a glorious thing. But if I use it to discipline my child, then it's horrible. Religion is just a system of tools. Recently, and this is a real life example. Recently, Mark Zuckerberg and his team changed Facebook. They changed not just the algorithm, but they changed some of the rules and the guidelines to Facebook. And the purpose for that was so that they could monitor who was posting what, when they were posting it, and why they were posting it. And a lot of this came from the 2016 election. A lot of this came from that because they found out, there are people actually putting ads on Facebook to get people to vote certain ways, to get people to do certain things, to get people agitated about certain things. They use this tool the wrong way. And if that can be used with something like Facebook, that we all have to go on a device to get on, then surely man will abuse something like religion as well. We'll use religion, and people have used religion to push political agendas, to push their ideologies, to take over certain countries. Religion has been abused, and as Christians, we have to accept that. We have to acknowledge the fact that religion has been abused by people. And the religion that many refer to, and what Jesus refers to, is similar. It's a system that's been abused. The tools have been misused and people have been taken advantage of. Now, Jesus' call to be cautious is one that should show us that although we may have been unfairly treated at some time, or that we may know some people who have been unfairly treated by the abuse of religion, that ultimately it's not because of religion, but ultimately it's because of people. That's what we can see. So Jesus is constantly pointing to the fact that religion is not the adversary. It's our selfishness. It's our fact that we use this tool, that we use this system to benefit us. So when he's talking about the Pharisees and he's talking about the people who hold tightly to the law, he's not condemning them for holding tightly to the law. He's condemning them for using that to benefit themselves so that they could be higher on the social ladder, so that they could be the ones that call the shots, so that they could be the ones that could benefit in other ways. Religion is not the problem. Sin is the problem. And just like everything in this world, sin has ruined it. When sin enters into a person, and sin lives in a person, and when they're focused on anything other than God's glory, then they pervert the practices of religion that should be glorious. When we use religion to benefit us, we're not just focused on our own kingdom, but we're actually focused on warring against God's kingdom. And the Sermon on the Mount, it's about God talking about God's kingdom. In Matthew 6 is Jesus saying, no, you're trying to build your own kingdom and you're trying to use religion to do so, and you can't. You can't. Religion has been seen by so many as oppressive and restrictive and abusive, but it's not because of religion itself. It's because of sin. So I had to push to our second point in this sermon, and one that'll go throughout this sermon series, which is being cautious does not mean that we should abandon religion completely. And Jesus calls us to be cautious in verse 1, but he never calls us to abandon religion. He says, be careful. He says, be careful. My dad is a driver's ed teacher. I think I've mentioned that before. And what he tells me a lot when we talk about this, which is, every once in a while, says, man, the enemy of good driving is overcorrecting. The enemy of good driving is overcorrecting. He says, so many times I'm sitting in the car and a kid will drift a little bit to the right, and he'll tell them, hey, you're drifting to the right. And instead of slowly trying to pull it back into the lane, they swerve and move into another lane. And they're thinking, oh, I kept myself out of a ditch. But you overcorrect and pull yourself into a place where there could be more danger. There's potentially more danger. When we try to abandon religion completely because of some of the ugly things we've seen in religious people, it's really an overcorrecting that opens us up to a level of vulnerability where we can also get hurt there and hurt other people. That's, I think, is the basis for a lot of people who say, I'm not religious. I'm spiritual. I'm not religious, but I love Jesus. It's that they try to overcorrect something that they attributed to religion instead of attributing to sin. It's an overcorrection. And although Jesus does a warning in the top of this chapter, guess what? There's not one verse in the Bible where Jesus condemns religion. There's not one verse where Jesus condemns religion. He gives us a lot of do nots about religion, but not one time does he say, don't be religious. Not one time. And that should kind of grab our attention. That is something that we should actually be happy about. When people come to us and tell us, hey, I love Jesus, but I hate religion, then you could say, well, Jesus didn't hate religion. So actually, you're a lot more out of line than what Jesus is. The greatest example of a person who lived within the system of religion is Jesus. That he did it perfectly. That Hebrews 7:26 would say, for it was indeed fitting that we should have such a high priest, referring to Jesus, holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners and exalted above the heavens. Jesus lived his entire life under the law, a law that was actually written to glorify himself. And if Jesus actually hated religion, which we know he didn't, then why didn't he just get rid of religion? Like when Jesus came, why didn't he just create his own law and get his own followers and start his own thing and push against the religion that was already there, the system that was already in place? Was Jesus afraid that if he pushed against religion, that religion would push back? No, he wasn't. He was not afraid. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why would Jesus subject himself to a system of religion? We have to. And wasn't Jesus radically against people who were overly religious in the systems? I mean, if you're doing some pretty bad exegesis, then maybe you can figure out some way to twist the fact that Jesus didn't like religious people, but the text really does not support that. And we can see that if we jump back to Matthew 5. Matthew 5:17, Jesus' words were against those who wanted to rage against the machine, who wanted to go against religious systems. But at the same time, they went against the Pharisees as well when he said, do not think that I'm here or that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I haven't come to abolish it. Jesus didn't come to abolish religion. And then in verse 18, he says, until heaven and earth both pass away, not the smallest letter or one stroke of the letter will pass away from the law until all things are accomplished. Matthew 5, what precedes Matthew 6, supports the fact that Jesus not only lived in a system of religion, but he pushed other people to submit to a system of religion because that system of religion actually glorified himself. It actually glorifies God. Jesus is clearly not an enemy of the law, and he's not an enemy of a religious system that upholds the law. But instead, he calls us to a rhythm that we can see through Matthew 6. And this rhythm is one where he warns us for practicing religion the wrong way. He challenges our motives or our intent. And then he centers us on how we should practice religion the right way. Now, nowhere in the Bible can you find a prohibition on religion. Instead, he worked to build upon the religious system. His words were to clarify the law that they already had. That his actions was to put flesh on the things that they were called to do, but they were incapable of doing. And in verse 5 of Matthew 6, he doesn't talk about if you pray. He says when you pray. In verse 2, he doesn't say if you give. He says when you give. In verse 16, he doesn't say if you decide to fast. No, he says whenever you fast. Meaning that there is already him accepting the fact that he expects you to live within the system of religion. Jesus encourages the regular displaying of devotion through belief, practice, and worship. Where being religious to the point where it's abusive and hurtful is caused by selfishness, abandoning religion is also another form of self-centeredness. It's saying that I don't need the community that comes with religion. I don't need the guardrails of religion. I don't need to submit myself to anyone else or be held accountable for anything else. All that matters is the fact that I say that I walk with Jesus, that I pray, that I love him, and it doesn't have to be affirmed by anything I do. When you say that you hate religion, yet you love Jesus, you're pushing against the very thing that Jesus has designed for us to help protect us. Jesus never goes against religion. And some people may claim to love Jesus and hate religion, but if they do, they most certainly aren't like Jesus. Is that worth it? Ultimately, if the chief end is that all things be united in Christ and made new, that our lives, that our sanctification is for the fact that we would look more like Jesus each day, is it worth risking that by saying I hate religion? I would say no. But I think there's a third thing we can get just looking over Matthew 6 in the whole, and we'll look at every single verse in the next few weeks. But the third point is this: as Christians, our religion is to be faithfully practiced for God's glory alone. Jesus doesn't tell us to abandon religion. He also condemns those who are overly religious. But his teaching actually calls us to be faithful in our practices of religion. Christians should be faithfully religious. And when I say faithfully, I'm saying that in terms of our fidelity, in terms of our consistency, and in terms of our motive, that we should be faithful in our reason for practicing religion. That we would be dependently practicing the things like prayer and giving and fasting, not because of anything that we want from God, but because of our understanding through relationship with God. Just yesterday, I was at the seafood festival out on Mary McLeod Bethune and in the middle of Midtown. And there was a brother out there who was selling a lot of African fabrics and purses and all of that stuff. And at 8:30, this brother got down on the ground and started doing his prayers. He was a Muslim brother. And if you know anything about Islam, this is Ramadan right now. So not only did he have to do the prayers that are required of him, but he's having to kind of double down on his faithfulness throughout this Ramadan period. And it just struck me. It just struck me like to be something that stood out in my mind. So I'm like, man, he's so unashamed about his devotion. Would I disagree with what he's worshiping? Yes. Would I come against, in some way and fashion, the God who he says he's worshiping? Yes, I would. Would I ascribe his method of doing so? No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't ascribe his method of practicing his devotion. But what I would say is that we have gone so far from wanting to practice our devotion publicly and sometimes even privately that there's a huge gap between what we see in the scriptures and what we live each day. I use that example not to call us to pray like a Muslim would, but to pray like Jesus would. That he was faithful in his practice of prayer. He was faithful in his practice of fasting. He was faithful in his practice of giving to the poor. And I feel conviction when I read those scriptures. Because yeah, I might have a pretty decent prayer life. Do I have a regular habit of giving to the poor? No. Do I have a regular habit of depriving myself of the things that are not stirring my affections for the Lord? No, I don't. Christians have to embrace the fact that our Savior, the one that we follow, the one who leads us, frees us from the penalty of not being able to do religion well. But through our relationship, he would actually motivate us to want to serve him faithfully. So that religion is no longer this list of have-tos. But religion now becomes a list of get-tos. And all of those get-tos allow us to show that we deeply love Jesus and we want to love him even more through devotion. That word devotion, it just means you're showing off your faithfulness. And throughout all of Matthew 6, we'll see that all of the responses that Jesus gives to the hypocritical nature of overly religious people who only care about themselves is a response that centers us on God. It says, I know you're going to do these things already, but when you do them to me. As Christians, we are religious people. We have to accept that there are regular practices in our spiritual lives that attest to the fact that we are devoted to Jesus. That every time we come in here, we do the same thing. We pray before we worship together. We sing 2 to 3 songs. I come up here, I look through the text, I read through the text, I try to exposit the text. Those are rhythms, those are practices. And instead of trying to appeal to the world and saying, no, we're not religious, we just love Jesus a lot, We have to reclaim the fact that Jesus allows for us to be religious, and he empowers us to be able to do it well because we're doing it in Christ. To wrap up, let me just say that another big part of this whole fight against being a person who hates religion but loves Jesus came about 6 years ago. And I told y'all about this a few weeks ago. There was this YouTube video that came out. It's by a brother named Jefferson Beck. And he's a good brother. I believe he's a Christian. I actually love a lot of what he put into this video. And he wrote this poem, Why I Hate Religion, But I Love Jesus. And in that, he gives this testimony about Jesus delivering him from an addiction to pornography, delivering him from living a life where he was a hypocrite, delivering him from so many things. And as beautiful as it was to hear his testimony, I felt like he neglected to mention the fact that there's a long history of Christians who did ascribe to religion, who laid a really good foundation for us to even be in faith right now. The religion, again, is just a system, but it's a system that God uses. That we have a track record, thousands of years of God using religion to stir the affections of man, to keep man faithful and to keep man consistently devoted to Christ. And although I can assume that this brother, Jefferson, I can assume what he was talking about, that I know that he was really talking about the abuse of religion. He was talking about the ill falls of religion. He was talking about those who were overly religious. I still don't think it's worth losing religion. I think it's better to hold tight to what Christ held tight to. In this poem, in the middle of the poem, he says these words: that religion is the infection, yet Jesus is the cure. If there's one thing I would want to erase out of that poem, it's that. Because the Bible doesn't teach us that. The Bible actually teaches us that sin is the infection and Jesus is the cure. And religion is just our expression of living out our worship, our practice of devotion, our love for Jesus. So over the next few weeks, I don't want us to be in this cycle of warring against those who would say that I love Jesus, but I hate religion. I also don't want us to war against those people who are overly religious. But what I really want is for us to zero in on something, and it's this: that we simply want to develop an understanding of traditional religious practices and value them apart from our own interest. That when we talk about prayer, we talk about prayer absent of our own interest. When we talk about giving, we talk about giving absent of our own interest. When we talk about a fasting, we talk about absent of our own interest. But we also build a value for these things because they're worth valuing. Jesus valued them for a reason. So I believe that we should too. Deep down inside, I know that religious people have done a lot of harm to people. But us, as Bible-believing Christians, those who love Jesus and are called to be followers of him, we can help serve those people and pray that they would get healing through Christ and show them, no, it wasn't the system that failed you. It was sin that failed you. But Jesus died for that sin as well. And we can continue to believe because the gospel shows us. The gospel shows us that we are free from all sin. If we believe in him and trust that he is our Lord and he is the one leading us in full devotion to God. So as we wrap up this time, I do want us to have some talk time. And we're not going to group up because we're a little smaller today. But I want us to talk through that. There's some questions on our sheets. And we can talk through those questions, or we can talk through any other questions. If there are objections or there are thoughts, if there are things that stick out in your mind, let's spend a couple minutes talking through those things right now. Yes.